Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Everybody, and welcome to the James Bond Book Club. My name is Bleasdale, John Bleasdale, and today I'm joined by an old friend and an old adversary, Dr. Yes, I'm going to call him Dr. Brian Baker. Brian is a writer, academic. He is currently, he's been working at the University of Lancaster for the past 18 years, and he has published books on a number of books and articles, I should say, on a number of subjects, as well as some creative writing projects and art projects that he's been interested in recently. Hi, Brian.
Hi there, John.
Have I missed anything out? That's a kind of brief thumbnail bio.
Yeah, I suppose in relationship to the matter at hand, a couple of my books, which were both on masculinities, had chapters on Bond. The first one more about Fleming and about this book actually, and the latter one more to do with Casino Royale and the 2006 film and mobility and that kind of stuff. And I've also written about Dayton, in particular Crest File, and most recently about espionage. I contributed to a book on Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So I know you kind of in the past, I know you're a Le Carre fan as well, John. So how different Fleming is from, because I've been kind of listening to different radio adaptations of Tinker Tailor and watching the film again and the BBC adaptation. Then you come back to Fleming and you think, oh, right, yeah. It's a completely different world we have here.
It's like a springboard that Le Carre is sort of going against and defining himself against, really.
But kind of I suppose the emphasis on spycraft that is in Le Carre, where kind of where you have all of that, all the jargon, the lamplighters and circus, and there's a kind of sense of a kind of code. And there's another world that you enter into. There's so little of that spycraft in Fleming, really. I think kind of, as I was kind of going through, I noted one thing where there's the kind of the briefcase gadget, isn't there? And M talks about using a one-time only pad. And I thought that's the only bit of real espionage in the entire book.
I mean, this has been a little bit of a running theory of mine as we go through this, and I think this is an interesting point you brought up, Le Carre. But my argument is very much that James Bond is kind of a terrible spy, and that the Secret Service is kind of a terrible Secret Service in Fleming's eyes. Even though he's apparently lauding them and celebrating, they're constantly being shown up to be far more gullible and far more unguarded and not up to the level of their adversaries. And in a sense, I think maybe I'm jumping ahead too much, but maybe Fleming is doing that not as a critique, but as a celebration of like, us British people are just too straightforward and honest, unlike these, conspiratorial foreigners who are much more unethical in what they are prepared to.
There's a bit of that, isn't there? And I think there's also a bit of the idea of the gentleman amateur, which you find much earlier in something like Erskine Childers' The Riddle of the Sands, where kind of the spy, he's not a professional spy, but they kind of get involved in something, and it's that kind of narrative. There's a moment kind of later on in From Russia with Love where Bond is musing about Karim and kind of having, what does he say, underpaid adventurous men who are ranged against this kind of machine of Smersh and the MGB, and you kind of think how interesting, because it's in that post-imperial moment or the moment of decolonization, but yet there's this kind of still this valorization of the kind of the amateur almost, kind of, even though they don't get any money, they're in it for the laughs essentially, but yet they still manage to pull off these amazing things. But you're right, I mean, Bond, not only is he not that good at his job, he kind of hates it at the same time as well, doesn't he? So he's kind of caught.
He's mainly there for the travel. He's there for the perks.
Yeah.
Oh, good, another chance to get out of London.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, out his flat in Chelsea with mate. He's like, oh God, yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. There's a book written, Cover Stories by Michael Denning, which talks about the idea of the pleasure periphery,
Mm,
and how kind of Bond's adventures always take place in the Caribbean or the tropics. It's very tropical, isn't it? The kind of the whole
mm.
Bond imaginary. And I think that's right. It's kind of he's going on his holidays, isn't it? It's the era of jet travel mainly. Although this one he kind of goes on a propeller plane, doesn't it? He kind of and quite a lot is made of him going on a propeller plane as well, and having a nice dinner on it. You kind of think, what kind of plane is this? 1955 breakfast service, and he has two martinis and a bottle of wine.
This is, I remember there was an article about this book, and it said, I think it was in the London Review of Books, and it said it counted his, he had a carafe of ouzo, two martinis, half a bottle of wine, and the concluding line was, "I'm surprised he didn't do a Yeltsin when he got off the plane in Istanbul." And most of our listeners probably won't understand the verbing of Yeltsin, but yeah, look it up.
He's probably, he's probably a functional alcoholic, isn't he, really?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, even there is an element of sort of like it beggars realism. Even like his food consumption. Remember a documentary where someone sat down at the casino in Casino Royale and tried to eat what he's eating at 3 o'clock in the morning, and just went, "There's no way you could eat this much. It's just
Yeah,
way too much. You drink and we you just feel like going for a nap, and he's going to go and like win this high stakes card game."
yeah, yeah. He has to let a notch out of his belt first, kind of. He just, yeah.
And the belief that Ian Fleming has in cold and hot showers is sort of like refreshingly naive as well. Just like,
Yeah. One of the things when I was writing about Len Dayton, one of the things that I was thinking about was how much of a gourmand that kind of the central figure in the books, and then of course in the film, the Ipcress File, is, who grinds his own coffee and makes, seduces women by cooking meals for them and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, Len Dayton did his own action cookbooks in the 1960s. And when I was looking through From Russia with Love again, I was trying to make a note of the meals that Bond has, and whether it had the same kind of sense of the aficionado about it, or whether it is something to do with class and taste. But it's really interesting because he has that meal on the plane, but some of the time he kind of has this kind of nice food, and it's kind of like there's something slightly strange about it. So when he's in the gypsy camp and he has this ragu, and the woman's like taking bits out of it and shoving it in his mouth, like a little bird being fed.
the best bit of meat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And
Um,
the best bit of that part is that they say this is an exotic thing that you'll never have tasted. It's called kebab. It's like, of course, in 1957, when this book was published, nobody knew what that was. But
no,
these
no, that's
days, it's
right.
like he's having a kebab.
A
That's
doner. Yeah, and it says doner kebab. Yeah, 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 yeah. Can I have extra tahini on it, mate? Yeah, yeah,
it's after the pubs. After the pubs have
yeah.
closed, he's off for a
Well,
sneaky
they've
kebab.
probably done half a bottle of Reka at the same time, hasn't they? So kind of, so yeah, that's not a light lunch, that is it? That's to be said. Um,
I think one of the things, just to put the book a little bit in context with the books that have come before, this is the fifth outing of Fleming's Secret Agent 007. And to me, it feels like the book is actually answering some questions that the other books might have been receiving. So one of those questions would have been, okay, this guy is supposed to be a British secret agent. How come he's never going against the Soviets? He's against a French guy who's been, the Soviets are there, but they're very much in the background. They're very much 3 steps away. In
mhm.
fact, a Soviet agent, Smersh, appears in the first book, but kind of says, "Oh, I don't have orders to kill you, so I'm not going to kill you," and kind of saves his bacon. Live and Let Die, Mr. Big is a Smersh agent, but again, Smersh don't get involved. What's the next one is
Moonraker.
Moonraker. Again, Smersh are sort of on the periphery, but Hugo Drax is the first sort of big another big proto Blofeld kind of villain.
Mhm.
And then we get Diamonds Are Forever, which is kind of a gangster story, which really has nothing to do with. So I think From Russia with Love, from the title on, is very much saying, okay, you wanted Smersh, you wanted the Soviet Union, here we go.
So I found it quite interesting that Burgess and MacLean are mentioned twice in the novel, and it's that seemed to be kind of a spectre that's kind of hanging, well, using that word, but it's something which hangs over the entire book in a sense. Really, is that idea of the because Tatiana is kind of a double, and so kind of that the idea of the double agent and Red Grant, of course, as this kind of figure who's crossed over. The idea of treachery is kind of in there. So I completely see what you're saying there, actually, that it returns to the kind of a Cold War milieu in a different kind of way. But again, it's interesting, isn't it? One of the things that Bond never goes to Berlin except for in The Living Daylights. That's the only thing he ever goes to Berlin for. So again, it's peripheral, isn't it? It's in Istanbul. It's not one of the hotspots of the Cold War. So it's kind of it's interesting, really, that kind of even if it's going back to a kind of much more Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union, it's still kind of marginalized.
It's almost like Fleming's just not that into you, Stalin. He's just not that interested in that conflict. It sort of doesn't. It's kind of a bit drab. It's a bit too much like hard work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Is there any scuba diving to be done, in the Baltic?
Yeah, not much going on in West Berlin, that is there? Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that's right, and I think that idea of work as well, the kind of the again that goes back to the idea of the gentleman amateur and the idea of the holiday. That there is something to do with playfulness, isn't there? In this, that kind of it's serious, but kind of again the game is mentioned quite a few times, which kind of obviously goes back to Kim and the Great Game. But there is a game playing quality to it, isn't it? I'm not sure how quite high the stakes are really in this. The stakes are actually quite low because they're just after him, and he's just and Bonds is just he's just an agent. They're not shooting the Prime Minister.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, I mean, that's one of the problems he has in understanding the whole plot is he can't understand his own importance. He's like, why would they kill me? Or they sort of said, like M at one point is sort of thinks about his own assassination only to dismiss it as like, they're sort of like, oh, why don't they just shoot me in London if they wanted to kill him? And M himself thinks, well, they'd never do that. I'm fine. I'm not, I'm not bothered.
Yeah,
And
he says, doesn't it? Oh, they'll just put a bomb in his car if they
yeah.
wanted to do it. So why bother with this? So kind of, yeah, it's one of those weird things in this book, isn't it? How, in a sense, the kind of the fabricatedness of it is kind of given to us right. It's foregrounded, really. The kind of all of this is fairly, yeah. It's as I said, the stakes are low. The kind of there's not really much going on.
Which I think makes it. I mean, I don't want to, go back to talk too much about the films or anything, but it does make it a very successful film as well. I know it's only the second entry, but I think that the films, as films, not as Bond films necessarily, which I think is a slightly different category, but as films, the films are always more successful the less there is at stake. And here it's just basically a Alfred Hitchcock MacGuffin in the Spectre machine. And
Yeah.
in the book, it's even less at stake because they're going to blow it up. So it's not,
Yes.
they won't even get it.
You kind of feel in the book that the Spectre machine it literally is a MacGuffin, isn't it? It's something in there to try to kind of make us feel as though, oh, this is a kind of plan worth taking on. Because if it was just Tatiana wanting to defect, no one would give a toss. They
Yeah,
wouldn't
she's
send
not
Bond out
high
there to
enough.
do it. It's not, yeah, she's not important enough. So yeah, so that's a kind of, I think you're absolutely right that kind of the Spectre machine is a kind of, but again, it not only is it MacGuffin, but it's cancelled out because it's booby trapped. There's the kind of referring to the films. It's like the kind of the end of For Your Eyes Only, where they throw the ZX-81 off the top of the mountain cliff. Kind of.
I don't think it's a ZX. It's a Commodore 64.
Okay.
Get
Well, it
it?
flies like a ZX-81.
It certainly does. ZX81, I had one of those. That was a rubberized keyboard, and ZX80 was the paper keyboard. Oh,
Yeah, maybe the ZX-80 it was because it's white, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh dear. Oh dear, that made waves of nostalgia crash upon me. Let's talk a little bit about how the book starts, because that's another
Mm,
thing that I think Fleming's really interesting with. There seems to be a movement in the books of consistently sort of moving away from Bond as the sort of central character, and half the book really, or a good third of the book, is devoted to other characters, and
yes,
Bond arrives very late in the
it does.
book. I mean, it's like page I'm not sure. In my edition, it's about 77 or something.
It's page 95 in mine.
Oh,
I,
okay.
I looked, again, I looked that up and I thought, oh yeah, where does part two begin? And it's, yeah, kind of, it's page 95. So that's out of just 250 odd. So
Right.
yeah, yeah, 2/5 of the way in.
Yeah, mine's 78, but my edition only has 207 pages.
Yeah.
So yeah, part two, the execution, and yeah, I mean, there's a whole part one, and there's only two parts to the book,
Yes.
I think, and the dominant two characters of that first half are going to be Red Grant, and I want to. Well, let's hear about Red Grant first, because knowing that you had written about sort of gender roles and masculinity, as I was reading it, I was sort of thinking, "Oh, we're going down towards the buttocks, and
Yeah.
lots of little blonde hairs there, and
Yeah. Yeah.
there's an almost microscopic focus on skin and hair and anatomy."
The other thing that's really interesting is that I think it might be in the very first line where, yes, the naked man who lay splayed out on his face beside the swimming pool might have been dead. So it
Mm,
starts off with a dead body, or
mm,
apparently dead, and the novel ends, of course, with what you think of as Bond having just taken a fatal kick to the shin from Rosa Krebs' knife. So it ends with a dead body, but they're both fake dead bodies because Red Grant isn't really dead and Bond isn't really dead either, as we'll find out in the next book. But you're absolutely right about kind of Red Grant's physicality, that he's completely fetishized, isn't he, as this kind of monumental, oiled up fascist machine, essentially. He's a total fascist body. It's kind of mechanical, impermeable, indestructible. When Rosa Krebs get the old knuckle duster out and slams it into his gut, he doesn't even flinch. Um, so there's a so it's it, I mean, kind of with Rosalind, it's kind of sexualized, but in a very odd way,
mm.
because he's kind of machinic at the same time. He's not really human. He's kind of pathological and a werewolf, really.
Oh yeah, because he's got the lunar cycle, and I mean, this is Fleming writing one of his darkest characters, actually. And I mean, this guy's a serial killer, and he's a
Yes.
serial killer who Smush have just said, oh, you'll be useful. I mean, they've hesitated. They sort of, should we just get rid of him? He's too much trouble, or
Yes.
can we use him?
That was really interesting, isn't it, when he approaches them, and they got quite a few of the bureaucrats seem to kind of think they're very close to just saying eliminate him, get
Mm,
rid of him, because kind of he's going to cause too many issues. And I suppose in what they really fear, I suppose that he won't be controllable.
mm,
That kind of if someone is that pathological and wants to kill, then they will exceed the programming straight away almost because. But that makes him human, whereas I think kind of Red Grant isn't quite human, is he? He pretends to be human and quite badly, particularly towards the end of the novel when he's on the train.
old man.
Yeah, old man. Whereas, as you say, if Bond wasn't kind of quite so addled, he'd be able to figure out straight away that he wasn't legit.
Well, I mean, he kind of does, oddly, which just shows how much you're willing to accept as long as he's British, because he kind of says, "Oh, this guy's probably schizophrenic or mad. Let's hope he doesn't crack up," and that doesn't disqualify him. He's like, "Well, he's still one of ours, so
Yeah, he's one of ours. Yeah, he might be very, very strange, but he's one of ours, so
yeah,
that's all right.
he'll probably
Yeah,
kill somebody someday, but
yes,
not my
exactly.
problem."
But in a sense, kind of, if you think about it, I mean, it's like I don't know who's the character in it's Dolph Lundgren in Rocky Four.
I had exactly the same image in my head. Yes, when he punches the machine and the machine says, "You hit hard,"
Yeah,
you punch very hard.
so it's that, isn't it? It's that kind of idea of this kind of sculpted the idealized body, but the idealized totalitarian body. Kind of
Mm,
there's nothing remotely human about it. And in Rocky Four, you don't think that Rocky can beat him because he's just kind of he's not made of the same flesh and blood as we are. That there is something other about it. So I think that kind of right from the very beginning introduces a really strange note into the book that is kind of like a serial, as you say, he's a serial killer, really. That there's a kind of pathological quality about the kind of what's going on that you don't really find in a lot of espionage novels because it threatens the plan too much. It threatens the system.
I
You
love
don't want the instrument doing stuff on their own.
Well, I love the fact that they actually contain that by saying we'll send him on the missions when it's not a full moon, and when it's a full moon, we'll send him to a prison where he can kill as many people as he likes. And it's kind of you can kill people who were going to die anyway, and if you want to kill 20 and we've got 20, that's fine with us. But when you're on a mission when you're sort of relatively okay and you
Mm.
just a normal sociopath, I mean that's
Then he's all right.
ludicrous. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean it's
yeah.
it's so excessive. I mean it's that thing of excess murder and then normal murder, and of course being the villain, the person you're pairing him with is actually going to be. I mean, there's a couple of pairings for Grant. There's Rosa Klebb because they're both asexuals, and
Yes.
then there's James Bond because they're kind of meant to be opposites. James Bond is supposed to be, I feel, and this is another question that I feel this book is kind of answering, which is why am I reading this book about a man with a license to kill who's basically a murderer?
Mm.
And it's almost like Fleming's going, no, Bond really worries about killing people and he's really upset about killing people. And this guy is a real murderer. This is a guy
Mm.
who is all the things you're telling me Bond is. This is an actual sadist.
Yeah, there's a line, isn't there, earlier in the novel where I think it says Bond has never killed in cold blood. So kind of it's really quite direct
Oh,
in
he
kind
gets
of
very
positioning.
upset when Kerim Bey or Darko Kerim shoots the guy from Marilyn Monroe's
Its
mouth,
mouth,
who's
yes.
who's sort of dangling. He's sort of like, yeah, he doesn't like it at all.
So I think that's right. That kind of it's positioning Bond to be not amoral. That he's kind of his soul is tarnished by but by what he's doing. I think. I mean, in something like The Living Daylights, that's very very. It's the point of the whole story, isn't it? Really, that kind of Bond is this kind of ruined man in a way that
Mm,
he can't really cope with the things that he's been asked to do. And I mean, throughout that's what's marks the Fleming books, isn't it? Is that sense of Bond? He's so world weary, really. That there is something really quite unpleasant about the situation that he finds himself in as a
mm.
double O. He might be on his holidays, but kind of what he has to do to get there is it taints him.
So we have Red Grant, who we see at the very beginning, and then we have Rosa Klebb and Tatiana Romanov, or Romanova.
Romanova.
Yeah, exactly. Who, is connected to the Tsars and connected to the white Russian sort of aristocracy,
Yeah,
right?
the older people.
Yeah, and somebody sort of says, which is a striking thing for someone to say I suppose it's not so striking in Khrushchev's Russia as it would be in Stalin's Russia, but we're all connected to old people, someone says. And that's like, wow, I would keep that under your hat if I were you.
I think it might be even Rosa Klebb who says that.
Yeah,
The kind of yeah, kind of you go back far enough, we're all connected to them eventually.
yeah.
I think, and the other person is just a bit of chin stroking, and it's like, okay, keep that to yourself, Colonel.
And I mean, she's connected to Red Grant because she's presumably got this kind of asexuality as well, although she's described in ways which Fleming really, really lets himself go in terms of, the female, his horror of this older,
Toad-like.
undesirable woman. Yeah.
There's that extraordinary moment where kind of after she's had the interview with Tatiana, where she turns up in a negligee with the fur on her top lip that kind of that you mentioned, and it's kind of like in the film of Diamonds Are Forever where Charlie Gray turns up in his dress, when he's when he's escaping. There's that kind of quality to it of this kind of something which ruptures the whole novel in a way. You kind of think, what is going on? Kind of why has she suddenly turned up in a negligee? Which kind of means then she's not asexual.
This is, yeah, it's
She's
sort of a contradictory, sort of like he's let his prejudice out of the bag a bit too quickly there.
yeah, yeah. Because she's not neuter, is she? She's clearly kind of coded there as a lesbian. But she's kind of. I think the other thing that connects her and Red Grant is a kind of in betweenness, isn't there?
Mm.
Because Red Grant, of course, he's Irish and German. He's on the border, so kind of he kind of Northern Ireland and the Republic. He then crosses over to the Soviet Union. He's got several names. Is it Granitsky?
Yeah, Granitsky, yes. Yeah, the sort
Granitsky, carved out of Granitsky. So there's this kind of ambivalent in between quality to both of them, really, and the idea of the neuter, which again considering you got Bond and Tatiana as the other two, and Karim, who's also extremely masculine, kind of they're coded that way because of their threateningness, isn't it? Really,
Mm.
that they're kind of they defy the categories in a sense, the Cold War binary categories, and it makes them monstrous, horrifying.
Whereas Bond and Karim are sort of like heartily heterosexual or gustily heterosexual and but also they're to a point of excess. Karim is like this alpha male fantasy of, you've got to treat women like dogs and they will
Yeah, that
obey you. And
extraordinary
literally,
scene that you count. Yeah,
literally keeping a woman naked under his table and sort of feeding her
yes,
scraps. And then when his mother comes and says, "What are you doing?" It's like you're really weird. What is this? And the woman wanted to stay, which shows you a lot about female psychology, Mr.
yeah,
Bond.
yeah, quite. Yeah, that's right. Kind of, Ian, your slip is showing there a bit, mate. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, you might want to tuck that in. Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of stuff I kind of love, though. I sort of love him. I love it when he shows his hand, because it's so fascinating. His fantasies are so fascinating because they're kind of nightmarish. Sometimes,
Yes,
was it Freud said, nightmares are just fantasies in disguise, and sometimes fantasies are sort of like other people's fantasies just look like nightmares to you.
nightmares. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things is that they kind of, it's almost like a club. They recognize each other. So Karim, when he first meets Bond, Bond knows he's going to be his friend forever and this kind of stuff. When those two meet the leader of the gypsy camp, his Bond is instantly recognized as someone who would be a friend, because of his cruel mouth, I presume. And then he's offered the chance to sort out the kind of the two knife fighting women later on, which he kind of turns down. And so there's this kind of, yeah, that kind of like recognizes like, isn't it? That these kind of slightly strange perverted men recognize each other when they meet up with each other, and it's become this kind of the bond. Then literally the bond
Yeah.
between them is this kind of, is this recognition of their cruelty, I think.
And these handshakes as well. There's a lot of
Yeah, the
sort of
handshake.
into a handshake. He doesn't have the wet banana feel of the Eastern handshake. It's sort of like a more strong, dry. Dry was the word he uses at one point. It's not oily or wet, but dry.
Yeah, and would crush you. It would crush your hand if you carried on shaking it. No,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that I mean, yeah, that line about the banana, yeah, that made me laugh out loud. Actually, kind of just kind of thought, oh, good Lord, uh, yeah. But
I
yeah, there is, isn't it? It's because you kind of think, well, actually, how far different is Red Grant really from that?
mm,
All it is a kind of a kind of a pathological extension of that kind of self-recognition that they have as kind of cruel men capable of sexual violence. Bond might feel bad about it. I'm not sure whether Karim does particularly, and capable of taking other people's lives. In hot or cold blood. So if, what you said before about Fleming deliberately in this book trying to bracket off Bond from some of these other kind of killers. I'm not sure whether it's that successful a job, really, because if you kind of just scratch the surface a little bit, there's not much that really separates Grant and Karim and Bond.
and the things that separate them aren't necessarily to do with killing. It's more like he doesn't have sex with women. I mean, Bond and that masseuse, that would have been, that would have been a sex scene fairly
Yeah,
quickly. And I think one of the things I really noticed on rereading the book is this is the by far the most explicit of the Bond books up until this point. And in fact, sex is kind of the whole reason Bond is on this mission. He's sort of like, I mean, he keeps saying, "I'm basically a prostitute, I guess."
for England. Yeah,
Yeah, I take one for England, James.
I back and think of
The
England.
things I do for England, I think it's the line I'm thinking of. I mean, I try to forget the films when I read the books, but it doesn't help that I'm constantly singing at the top of my voice the theme music from Russia with Love as I'm reading it. I just need to
Yeah, of
stop
course.
doing that, I think.
Yeah.
That would help. you were talking about the sort of the pleasure element of him just turning up and sampling local foods. And I mean, I love the reason he chose the local hotel because the name made him laugh. It's called the Crystal Palace, and it's sort of like, oh, spelt sort of phonetically. And it's just that's the only reason he got the hotel, because he thought it was a funny name.
And then he turns the tap on and a caterpillar comes out.
Yeah. Right, that's one star gone on TripAdvisor straight away.
So that's something that kind of carry on abroad. Um, yeah, and then of course he switches rooms, and very clearly there's a fake mirror there, and doesn't he recognise the fact that that mirror has clearly got it's clearly a two-way mirror, kind of why else would they have switched the rooms for him? Do we find out what happens? That kind of is left hanging, isn't it, in the novel? That there are compromising pictures of Bond. Is
I guess the idea is that without them being found in the body of and the blackmail letters and the whole story, that would
it's a
all
dead
be
letter,
cleaned up. But yeah, I mean, surely they would have kept copies, and that would be in a file somewhere.
a
His
file somewhere.
compromat, the word that
It's
we
it,
all
yeah,
know,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Donald Trump and his golden showers in Moscow during the Miss Universe.
But it does tie in really interestingly, doesn't it, to that idea of pimping for England,
Mm.
that his body, kind of becomes a sexual instrument.
And he thinks about it overtly. He's sort of like saying, "Will I be able to get it up? What do they do? Do they think about the gold? Is that how will it work for me if I think about the Spectre machine?"
Yeah, yeah. Wonder what he turns to. Wonder what his interior fantasy is. Yeah, 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 yeah.
His hurricane room. I mean, talking about
Ah,
him flying.
mm,
This, similar to Live and Let Die, the second novel, has a scene in which the flying suddenly becomes dangerous and they're just turbulence.
mm.
And I just love the fact that in the 50s, a bit of turbulence is like an action scene almost. It's like, oh, we could die. This is a moment where he could genuinely feels close to dying. And he goes into his hurricane room, that private center of his identity, which yeah, again, is it's sort of like, yeah, other people might call it repression.
I mean, I thought I'd completely forgotten that detail, but until I reread the book, and it's what it reminded me of actually was Hannibal Lecter, because Hannibal Lecter has his
Mm,
memory palace,
that's true. Yeah.
and that's of course a very old kind of mnemonic, kind of technique. Theatres of memory. Francis Yates kind of wrote a whole book about it. Kind of this idea
Umberto
of
Eco did some essay about it as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So kind of that whole idea of having some kind of internal space where you kind of go to as either as somewhere where you array kind of knowledge to in with certain kind of keys and triggers that kind of helps you memorize things, or like him, it's just his safe space, isn't it? But I thought it was I thought it was fascinating that kind of that he has this kind of interior architecture Bond, and he self-consciously steps inside it. I think he kind of says that he steps outside of the room. So there's this kind of spatial kind of quality, and he steps outside of the room and he's looking out the window of the plane. So
Mm.
you can imagine a really interesting kind of cinematic version of that, kind of where it kind of cuts on two levels of reality, really. Because there's a really odd ontological inset space. Because in his hurricane room, does it look like Goldeneye? I wonder. Probably does, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. It's in the West Indies. It's in Jamaica because that's his sort of point of reference for
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, Fleming always had this thing of like, I think it was just some bullshit he said to interviewers that Bond doesn't really have a character and he's empty and he can't understand why people are fascinated by him. But on the evidence of the books, I think he's entirely the opposite. I think Bond's a
Mm,
complicated character who's kind of changing up throughout the books as well. He's never
mm.
quite the same person. There's always a sense that he's going a little bit a step further in and growing in quite organically.
Yeah, and you're going back to Le Carre, the kind of world weariness we get of Smiley. You can imagine Bond almost becoming Smiley, much, much older. Kind of he's seen everything. There's no illusions left. He's married to someone who cheats on him all the time, which is basically his comeuppance, and that's it. Kind of what. And but all he does then is to be. He's kind of in the circus, pulling on the strings rather than being a field agent. So in a sense, he's a kind of. I think you're right. There is this kind of misunderstanding of Bond as or mispresentation of him by Fleming as this kind of cipher, where he's much more of a kind of he's on the slippery slope, isn't he? Really, is he probably in his about 40, is he? Is he in his late 30s?
Well, the age shifts because at the beginning of Casino Royale, it says that he bought this car that he's driving, which is a sort of souped up Bentley, which looks like a shoe. It's not a. It looks like an old car from a Monopoly
Yeah.
board, you know.
Right.
Um, he bought it like in the 30s, and it would sort of basically it would age him as 10 years old if that's
Mm,
if you take his birth date from a certain point.
mm,
So it shifts as the novels move essentially
right.
to keep him more or less
The same
in
age.
his late. Well, he does become older as it goes on, but I think it shifts a few years so as not to keep it credible that it'd still be in service essentially. But people criticize the Daniel Craig films for sort of having him start in Casino Royale and then be almost already exhausted by Skyfall. Well, the books are like that because we're only 5 books in, and he's already sort of suffering quite a lot. And by
Yeah.
Doctor No, which is the next book, he's come out of the poison. Obvious spoiler. He doesn't die, as you said. He comes out of and the doctor is basically saying to M, this guy's almost done. You've almost had enough of him. You need to be very careful with what you do next with him because you've pushed him as far as you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that Daniel Craig sort of accelerated career, if you like, is really true to the books. I mean, you don't have to kill that many people or be killed that many times to you grow. It's like dog years.
Yeah. Yeah.
You grow old pretty quick.
Yeah. 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 And you kind of think, the shelf life for field agents must have been very, very short,
Yeah.
you know.
It's like a Premier League striker. You're not looking at 20 years. You're looking at, what,
Four or
five
five.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
at
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
peak, at their absolute peak.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And either then they become a liability, or you have to kind of give them a desk job, or you get rid of them if no
Yeah.
one really leaves the service. Yeah, so I think that's really because there was a moment in the book where I think it says he enters the service in 1938.
Mm.
So he's been kind of, so if this is meant to be 50, about 56, then so he's already been at the job he's in the service for 18 years. So it's a hell of a long time to be doing what he's doing.
And he's been a double O since the end of the war because he kills a Japanese cipher and a Norwegian guy. Those are his two kills that
Yes,
give him the double O
the double
status,
O.
which I thought was another thing that they carried over in the book that was excellent in the Casino Royale,
Yes, yeah,
the
yeah.
Daniel Craig.
No, absolutely. Yeah, a film I really like. So that would really make him, even if he entered the service directly after university, he's got to be in his late 30s, if not early 40s, really. And so his shelf life is he's probably not got long left, has he? He's only probably got a few years, and he'll be pensioned off somewhere, or it will catch up with him.
And there's an element as well, going back a little bit to the sex, and I think this is an interesting sort of mirror to the sort of misogyny of a lot of it. There's no way of sort of beating around that bush too much, but the misogyny is also connected to this sort of almost gauche romanticism on the part of Bond, that he's constantly falling in love with these women and they're constantly leaving him. I mean, you talk about Anne and George Smiley in the Le Carre novels, but there's hardly a woman that Bond meets in the books that he doesn't want to marry. It's like Vesper he wants to marry, then he wants to leave the service and marry, and she's like, actually, I'm compromised. There's a brilliant scene in Moonraker, the last page of Moonraker, where he meets Gala Brand to sort of whisk her away on a European holiday as sort of reward. And she says, "Oh, by the way, James, I'm getting married this week," and he leaves him there, sort of like a little bit, blue balled. which is a good way because the beginning of the book starts in Blades, which was famous for its black balls, obviously. So
There we
there you go.
go.
It all comes round. It
It
all comes
does.
round. It's not just a filthy joke, Brian. It's it's a callback.
Yeah,
Literary
it's
callback.
a structural return to where we began. No, exactly. Yeah, he says kind of about Tatiana that Bond. He says Bond wanted it to be true. He wanted to believe. He wants to believe in this idea that she's got a crush on him, some kind of starry. You kind of think about it when he first is told about it. He kind of says, doesn't he? He kind of what, and he believed it. You know, kind of this. It just
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But yeah, I think you're right that there's this kind of. But I suppose is that then the kind of correlative of his burnout that he, in
Mm.
a sense, he has to retain this kind of romantic possibility of escape or a second side to himself just to cope with the kind of internal corrosion, really. There has to be this kind of romantic image of himself that he can project onto his sexual relationships to be able to carry on living in a way. You know, otherwise it's just murder and horribleness.
I think he's genuinely in love. I mean, there's like even in this book, there's a bit where he's at the very beginning. He's very, he says he hates peace, and he's the blubbery arms of peace have got image
Yes.
again. The body image is amazing. At the beginning of part two, when were introduced to Bond, he's recovering from a love affair with Tiffany Case,
Yes.
who has left him. Who
Mm.
has got on with, we were too similar, he says. And you could tell he's not telling the whole story. Yeah, she met some other guy, and it's like, no,
American,
she
yeah,
she
yeah.
dumped you, man. She dumped you, and that's why he's depressed. He wants to get out there, and then they show him a picture of a attractive girl, and he's like, oh,
Oh,
oh. That's, and when she meets him, she says, "You look like an American movie star." And he's like, "That's the worst possible thing you can say to a man." And it's like, "You love it."
yeah,
Shut up, Bond. You
exactly.
love it.
Oh dear. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's work. And the whole thing is that she's got literally a kind of a film star crush on him, hasn't she? You know,
Yeah,
kind
and
of
she's Greta Garbo. They say again and again
yes,
and
over and
again.
over
They
again.
even give her a passport with Greta Garbo's picture in it.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, a young guy, but that's absolutely right. I mean, I think kind of the filmic qualities. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's, as you say, it's the second book to be filmed, and it comes out in 57, does it, this one?
Yeah, 57.
It's 6 years later. But it's so kind of it's almost kind of set up for filmic qualities, isn't it? Yeah, kind of, and it's accentuating the cinematic, from the lips of Marilyn Monroe, the Greta Garbo stuff. I was kind of Istanbul is mentioned as like a theater set. What when Bond first meets Karim, the latter says, or Karim says, what they do is like movie making.
Yeah, that's true.
And on the plane to Istanbul, of course, Bond is reading Mask of Demetrios. So there's this kind of very self-reflexive quality to it all, as though they're kind of playing parts in a film already.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's true because Fleming was sort of fishing for film opportunities. Moonraker was sort of famously very double-sided in the sense that half of it was written as a script for a film, and the
That's
other half
right.
was like a short story, and you sort of put it together to make the book complete.
There's something about Thunderball as well, isn't there? Which is that was that
Well,
script as
that
well?
actually led to decades and decades and decades of litigation.
Wrangling. Yeah.
Yeah, because basically there was an American producer called Kevin McClory who Fleming was friends with him in Jamaica. I think he was a fellow sort of Jamaican timeshare owner or whatever they were. And on the beach, they kicked around these ideas about a possible film script, and it didn't come to anything. And so Fleming, being very sort of not particularly careful about these things, decided, okay, I can use that for the next novel, and so used the story. And McClory went, hang on a minute, that's legally belongs partly to me. Thunderball has always been, and not only Thunderball, but things like Spectre until quite recently and Blofeld were, they would get sued when they used Blofeld. And so that's why in For Your Eyes Only, Blofeld gets not named but tipped down a chimney, was because we can't use him anymore.
Right,
So
right.
it's like let's get rid of him in the most undignified fashion possible, as a kind of like FU to Kevin
Yeah,
McClory.
right, get you. Oh,
Endless
that
sort of
provides a different context to that silly bit of nonsense. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And then Spectre, the film that came out with Daniel Craig, was kind of
Mm.
like we've done it. We've got the name. We can use Blofeld again. We can use Spectre again. And then they came out with perhaps the most disappointing Daniel Craig movie. Although I don't think it's as bad as everybody says. I think it's got some really great moments. It's actually I don't know. I'd probably maybe No Time to Die might be sort of head, neck and neck in terms of not the not great,
Yeah,
Daniel Craig films.
no, no, agreed, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Quantum of Solace, I will die on that hill. I love that film.
Yeah, I need to go back to it because I've heard opinions like your own, where kind of because I was not very impressed with it when I first saw it, but I'll have to go back and look at it again and maybe kind of reevaluate.
Oh, it's so short. It's like 90-minute Bond film. It's
Yes, I know. Yeah, it feels like it
breathtaking.
as well. Yeah, yeah, it feels so compressed. Yeah, but I think kind of that idea of the cinematic, that kind of there's something not literary about it, is that there's something kind of there's something quite metafictional almost about From Russia with Love. It's kind of as
Mm,
you say, it's referential of the books that came before. They're all mentioned in
yeah.
some way or other. All the stories are. It's almost like the beginning of on a major Secret Service film where you have all of those clips from the past films. It's almost a kind of like, we've done all this stuff and now we've got this, and keeps you waiting for Bond to actually arrive on the stage. So
Mm.
there's something quite teasing about the idea of this book's place at the end of a sequence of stories that kind of that the other people would have written. I suppose, kind of if you didn't know who Bond was, this book would is quite an odd book. If this is your introduction to James Bond, he doesn't arrive until 100 pages in. There's lots of references to parts of the narrative that you wouldn't have read, and so kind of there's a kind of backstory that you'd need to fill in. And once he actually gets there, he's not this kind of adventurer. He's this kind of rather dour, kind of grim-faced, kind of assassin.
Who tends to be a passenger in for
Yes,
most of the narrative. I mean,
yes,
literally,
literally.
he's on a train. He's not even driving a car. With Kerim, he's just being shown around the city and sort of sitting down at various tables. And Kerim's very funny as a guide because he's constantly saying how rubbish everything is. Try
Yeah,
this. It's horrible. You'll
it's
have to
crap. Yeah.
drink. Yeah, exactly. There's a real sort of I don't know that I'm not sure if that's part of Kerim sort of treat them mean, keep them clean, keep the bleh, treat them mean, keep them keen philosophy. But he said, it means that he's always in a sort of secondary position, Bond. Even on the train, Kareem's there, and that sort of has to get when he's killed. You sort of think, oh, well, who's going to take care of Bond? Which is an
Yeah,
odd thing to think.
yeah,
Also, you wonder why nobody's just sort of parachuted in, grabbed the Spectre, and parachuted out again I'll just drop it off at the first stop rather than have someone come and look after me.
yes,
Why can't
yeah.
they
I
just
know
take it?
exactly. You're absolutely right about him being a passenger because he's on the plane, isn't he? He gets driven around. He's on the train at the end. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. He doesn't. He doesn't actually. He's not an agent at all, really. And he's not. He doesn't really. That's one thing that really struck me about the book. That nothing much really happens in this book, does it?
Yes.
The story is really very, very thin. You do it in a short story very easily. There's the defection and there's an escape attempt, and that's it. Kind of it's there's and so in a sense that kind of idea of him being ferried around, it's partly because of the thinness of the material. There's really no case. There's no mission here really.
And I mean, the mystery is kind of like, is this thing true or not? Because if it's a trap, then it should stop. It's very easy. Just don't go. Just don't accept it.
Yeah,
And if it is, then we'll do it. And there are references in like, oh, they were up all night thinking about it, and they had to cancel, and there was like all these people sitting around a table, and it's like, really? And they still
and
sort
they're
of
still went
thought
ahead.
this. Yeah, exactly. It's like that, new advert for iPad, which has been so roundly, criticized on the web. I just can't believe that there were so many people who just went, "Yep, that looks great." That
Who'd have thought
everybody
that
will
was a
love
good
it.
idea?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's this moment, isn't there? I think is it when he's actually with Red Grant at the end, or is it might just be before, where he knows that kind of how bad the situation is, and he kind of says to himself or thinks to himself, there are loads of opportunities where I could have just stepped outside of it. There are so
Yeah.
many doors open for me to not be in this position, but he didn't go through any of them. And so again, it's a really interesting moment in the book, I think, where you kind of get this kind of sense of, as you said, kind of a while ago, that it's full of mistakes. They just make mistake after mistake after mistake about all of this.
Which draws it closer to what you said about Le Carre, but I would draw a different conclusion,
Yeah,
which is this is actually really quite like Le Carre, but sort of
yeah.
seen from much closer, in the sense of much closer in time. And I think Fleming is sort of almost going, in our defense, we really didn't see this coming. We really trusted these amateurs. We trusted these guys that we picked up at university, and we just thought they were like us. We assumed they were like us. Yeah, we knew he drank too much, and we knew he was a bit of a nutcase, but I know him, his mum and dad, and he went to my school
Mm.
you
Mm.
know um and so in that sense, this is a sort of huge intelligence failure that Bond just manages to luck out. He just manages to kill Red Grant when he gets the opportunity, hopefully survive Rosa Kleb's poison. But even then, when he goes into the room and he knows, and he's like, oh, is it, oh, sorry, I seem to have come in the wrong room because you just look like a little old lady and you look fine. Oh, I can't. And he's sort of like, she's like, I'm sorry, I'll have to ask you to leave. And he's like, okay, no, wait a second.
Wait a second. Oh, hang on,
Yeah,
what are those knitting needles you've got there?
yeah.
Yeah,
There's something on the end of them, poison. It's even there, you're sort of thinking, have you learned nothing?
yeah.
Even you're given this opportunity to sort of show, okay, you would have fooled me a week ago, but after what's happened, I'm on to you. And he still sort of almost walks out of the room.
I mean, you mentioned the idea of kind of critique earlier on, John. I mean, but do you think there is anything to that? Obviously, Le Carre is very skeptical, about, the kind of the delusions really of kind of post-imperial British espionage and its pretensions to be a player in the great game. Do you think that there's anything of that in Fleming at all? Do you think kind of that he is pointing out
I
the incompetencies and the kind of in a book like this, which if you look at it very closely, there's no triumph in this. Bond gets away literally by the skin of his teeth.
I think there isn't the sort of political critique that you have in Le Carre, which is very sort of, he's read The Guardian, he's very conflicted from the very get-go about what he's doing. I think Fleming, his own wartime activity was often a very thin line between, audacious heroism and a shambles. There were various things that he promoted which went in and was
Mm,
hugely successful, and there are other things that he promoted which, literally left people dead on the beaches and
mm,
was and he did have a habit of burnishing his own reputation and burnishing the legend of it. He was very famously kind of in love with his immediate superior, who is the basis for M. But the thing about Fleming is that he's transparent in putting that into the books.
mm.
Bond loves M with such an adoration as to be almost like puke making. It's kind of like, really? Are okay, it's so transparent. It's so, you know, you're wearing his emotions on his sleeves. So I do think there is a sense that Fleming had this idea of a pre-Burgess Secret Service that was very the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare
Mm.
and very, I've got an idea, chaps. What if and he was becoming increasingly aware that that wasn't up to
No.
the business. I mean, in a sense, that might explain why he sends Bond to America to, have a fight against the mafia in Diamonds Are Forever, because it's sort of like, okay, this is something we can do. But even there, Bond is incredibly crap in terms of how he underestimates the mafia. It's like, oh, they're all ice cream makers and opera singers. I'll be fine, and does remarkably dangerous things because he's underestimated them. And I mean, the reason he's tortured in all of the books is because he makes very stupid mistakes and gets captured.
Yeah, it's such an interesting kind of thing to consider that because especially the kind of I suppose the rhetoric of the films is it seems to kind of celebrate this very retrogressive idea of Britain as this kind of in a sense you know as opposed to the cousins that it's really the British who are the skilled operators combating Soviet, kind of penetration of the West, in terms of espionage. Whereas, as we said before about how small the stakes are here, it's kind of just a little tiny sideshow.
And he's always getting rescued. At the end of this, it's René Matisse
Yeah.
who rescues him
Yes.
in Casino Royale. He's bankrolled by the CIA in Felix Leiter, and he's saved by Matisse again.
Yes.
He's I mean, if you were a Brexiter and you read these books, you'd be kind of fuming because you'd be going, we don't need the French and we don't need the Americans and we don't need the Turkish. Well, you do. I mean,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
absolutely Bond without this help. Or even, in Jamaica, he has Quarrel,
Yeah.
who teaches him stuff in Live and Let
Yeah.
Die. He teaches him how to scuba dive, which Bond
Mm.
doesn't know, and Bond acquires that skill.
Yes.
So I think there's a real sense that that power fantasy that you have in the movies is almost inverted in the books, that it's almost like a powerless fantasy. And that's why in the books he is so much of tourist.
Yeah. Yeah. And Passenger.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, I think that's such a really interesting reading, John. That kind of yeah, that I completely see that now. I mean, I always kind of understood the kind of the bond of the books to be this kind of man eaten up from within, essentially, and kind of having this very different sense about the British role in the world. We don't show our teeth anymore, only gums, he says at one point.
Mm.
They only eat soft carrots. But I think you're right as a kind of. I mean, is there a nostalgia then? It's interesting you said about kind of Fleming's wartime operations that there is then a kind of nostalgia for the romantic amateur gentleman spy who they managed to muddle through and do these kind of things, and some of them failed, but you forget about the failures and you just kind of big up the kind of the against the odd successes, which kind of there were many presumably, but there were also many failures. There's almost like a kind of a double game at work here, then, isn't there? At one point, there's a kind of critique and a kind of acknowledgement of Britain's fading role in the world in terms of it being no longer a great power and all this kind of stuff. But also, there's a kind of longing for that moment when kind of the gentleman amateur could make a difference, and with panache and
Mm.
style, and because they weren't professionals, they were doing it in a different kind of way, which kind of it gives it a kind of, as you say, a romantic ethos rather than professionals just doing their jobs or very tired old bureaucrats, kind of deciding the lives of thousands of people, 200,000 miles away. It's such a it's close, but also there's a kind of I don't know. I suppose it's no surprise that you've got chess or in Casino Royale the card game because there's a kind of sleight of hand. There's some kind of conjuring going on in this
Oh,
book, I think.
games are going all the way through. You have like chess here, you have Diamonds Are Forever, you have blackjack and horse racing, Moonraker, you have bridge, so it's almost every novel has
The game.
a game. Live and Let Die, I guess, has a tarot cards being played in a
Yes.
slightly different fashion, but it's still this sort of idea of a game
Yeah.
being manipulated and being to some degree, it's also that, cheating at cards and
Yes.
and you know and not being able to and seeing someone's tell and seeing someone's psychology is really important. Okay, I think it's time for us to think about our final sort of 007 facts
Mm.
about or any other business or rounding up what we've discovered. And we're not going to be too worried about the number, but just as a way of closing off the episode. So do you want to go first, Brian?
Yeah. Okay. So fact number one would be that you mentioned the theme tune to the film, sung by Matt Monro, the singing bus conductor. We have discovered that really James Bond is really a passenger on that bus rather than the driver.
Excellent. Yes, that's very good. Number two, I'm going to go with my sort of the sexiness of James Bond here. Previously, we've always had sex, but there's been a certain coyness. Whereas here we have extended sex scenes, and we have her turning up and being, and it's kind of central to the plot, turning up in bed with just a ribbon on, which I think is sort of sexy. And you also have this thing where he talks about when they make love in the train. There's this description that's a paragraph long where they talk about the love knot that they make, these two bodies coming together.
Yeah.
And then even further, there's when he realizes there's a film and everything, he talks about his vanity and what they must have seen, and he imagines them filming it. And you've seen that as readers. As readers, you've seen them sort of the filmmakers sweating as they watch this. So it's a really lurid sort of episode.
Oh, it's there's a sleaziness, isn't there? Yeah, you say it kind of there's that image, isn't there, of the sweat dripping into their collars as they're breathing heavily. What you're kind of looking down their viewfinders. No, exactly. But that's described in a really quite an abstract way. It's kind of it's the bodies are coming together and moving apart again. So it's really interesting that you've got this kind of changing kind of quality there as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he can only be suggestive rather than explicit because this is the 50s. It's pre. I mean, I'm assuming is this pre Chatterley's Lover or
Yeah,
it
that was
would.
1960. That was.
Yeah, exactly. So he's doing what novels of this kind would do more maybe more graphically later on. But yeah, it's funny how interested he is in that rather than car chases and gunfights.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Another fact would be if you look down the chapter list, the kind of the chapter titles, it could be a novel written by J.G. Ballard. The kind of I was really really surprised by the kind of the gnomic quality of the chapter titles. The Wizard of Ice, Background to a Spy, Killing Time, Conspiratsia, A Tie with the Winds or Not. There's something. It's not. There's something kind of quite abstract and odd about the whole framing of this narrative. We talked about the structure,
Yeah,
the
The
being
Mouth of Marilyn Monroe could be
Bath
a
of Marilyn
short
Monroe. It's a
story by
totally
J.G.
Ballardian
Ballard.
image,
Yeah,
kind of it kind of and again the whole kind of idea of hoardings, Bond as a film star, celebrity culture. There's something that anticipates the 60s really. It's a kind of a novel which is quite proleptic in its what's coming in terms of popular culture. It's not partaking of that culture at all, but it's kind of on the fringes. It's kind of on the it's just at the kind of the edge of vision. That new culture of the kind of celebrity spectacle, which Bond will become a part of.
absolutely. I would go with another inspired by what you just said. I would go with another for number four. Chapter 13 is called BEA Takes You There, which is quoting and
It
advertising.
is,
And
yeah.
I think this is also the part of Fleming where he starts to notice modernity and the recovery from the war coming in.
Mhm.
And so he notices the big hotel in Istanbul. And, one of the reasons he goes to Crystal Palace, even though it's named after an English place, is because it's more sort of authentically Turkish rather
Mhm.
than this big Hilton chain hotel essentially. And similarly he talks about going into going along a road and there being advertising hoardings before he gets to Istanbul from the airport, and there's just this sense of commercialism sort of creeping in, uh, and Bond's resistance to that. This is something that he doesn't necessarily want to. It blights the landscape.
Yeah, and the city too, because there's kind of a quite romantic, isn't the kind of image, isn't there, of Istanbul, the old Istanbul,
Mm.
and then kind of the idea of the kind of the Hilton and these other kind of new modern buildings, kind of in the background, but kind of almost like a tide are going to come down the hill and which has actually happened, of course, in Istanbul. Precisely that has happened there. So again, it's quite proleptic. And I suppose kind of if thinking about what I said before that he never goes to Berlin, so you don't have that Cold War. But I mean, Istanbul's interesting because it is it's the crossing point of East of Europe and Asia. And so the idea of division of the kind of the split city and a place between tradition and modernity is kind of I think it's quite a canny setting really for this for
Mm.
this for this book because again it does kind of mark that kind of the place that Bond is in himself both as a kind of connoisseur who's resistant to popular culture as it's coming, but also as a British establishment figure of the period where certain kinds of modernity will be embraced almost 10 years later with the white heat of technology, et cetera, and the Wilson government, but are deeply threatening to the
Mm.
fabric of British life because of the loss of empire and everything else. So yeah, so I think Istanbul there becomes a really quite a sophisticated, kind of way of providing a fabric, a setting which informs the whole thing, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way when they're on the Orient Express, they go into Venice and he's like, "Oh, it's Venice." And she's like, "I want to have sex now." It's
Yeah,
all like,
yeah,
it's like, "But you in Venice?" And she's like, "Yeah, no, sex, please."
A fifth one would be that I suppose I think it's the quality of the writing in a way. That it's I'm a big fan of H.G. Wells, and Wells is obviously kind of known for the stories for War of the Worlds or Time Machine or Invisible Man, inventing these amazing kind of scenarios. But actually, if you look at he's a very canny writer. There's a really kind of subtle sophistication about what he's doing, and I wouldn't say kind of it's sophisticated writing, but there's a weave in this novel. The structurally how it's unusual in terms of Bond isn't in it for the first two fifths. The kind of the intertextual references, the way in which it's kind of interfacing with different kind of cultural phenomena. There's a kind of really interesting quality to the writing in a way. It's not just functional in telling a spy narrative, and it's not kind of just a kind of misogynistic, romantic, imperial power fantasy. There's a whole lot of different discourses kind of woven in here, you can kind of which are really fruitful to unpick, aren't they?
I totally agree. I totally agree about H.G. Wells as well. I think War of the Worlds is as good as Heart of Darkness when it comes to, colonial sort of critique and also the beauty of the writing. I think
Absolutely, yeah.
it's absolutely stunning. Writer H.G. Wells, and I agree with what you say about the writing with Fleming. I think I definitely approach my rereading, even for this podcast, with a sort of patronizing idea of like the stories are good, but the characters are good, and he has these quirks that are kind of entertaining, kind of in spite of himself. The scrambled eggs and which he doesn't eat in From Russia with Love. It's the first one so far where he's not had a plate of scrambled eggs. So that's
Omelette fine herbe.
yeah. Well, what does he have for breakfast? What does May make him for
Oh,
breakfast?
boiled egg
Oh,
and
boiled egg. So he has
a couple of
some egg, but
yeah, he has a boiled egg, some toast with some jam and
no, he
marmalade.
had three different pots of jam. I remember
Three, yeah,
that.
yeah, no,
Yeah,
two jams and one marmalade it is.
that's it. Of course, yes.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And
And
Jersey butter.
of course, that comes from a specific cow.
Oh, he won't eat brown eggs, is it? I think,
Yeah,
or is it white eggs? It's one or the other.
yeah.
He's very much a connoisseur of the egg. He can tell from the outside.
It's so funny because he even actually says at that point, I know this is a bit stupid, but it's almost as if, he's inventing a thing to want as a
Yeah,
way of sort of
exactly.
getting away from not being able to choose. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll choose this one because that at least I have a way of doing it. So I totally agree because I think aside from all those quirks, I think the actual writing is amazing, and I think there's a real journalistic flair to some of the descriptions. I think the travelogues become kind of the point, and this will bring me to my sixth sort of thing I noticed about From Russia with Love, and that is the way the novels increasingly are becoming not stories that are set in places, but as ways of moving. They're becoming, it's not like there's a story where we need to go to A to get something and yada yada yada. It's more like we need to go to A and then to B and then to C. What's the story that will allow us to do that? Which is how ironically the films are made nowadays. It's sort of like we need to shoot a big scene in Brazil, a big scene in Norway, and a big scene in a southern Italian town. Give us a narrative reason to be in those three different places,
mm,
or four or
mm.
five or whatever. I think Fleming's kind of doing that. He wants to have the Orient Express. He wants to go through these towns. He wants to go to Turkey. He wants to be in Georgia at the very beginning. Also, one of the strange things about this being the Soviet Union, of course, is sort of like there's mentions of Ukraine and things like that,
Yeah.
as all the Bulgarians, all these sort of satellite states, parts of the Soviet Union, which
Mm.
are not Russia, and have different ethnicities.
Well, it's interesting, of course, because Karim mentions Bulgars quite a lot, and of course, Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Right, of
So there's a
course.
kind of previous imperial history which the whole narrative is taking place on top of. So that's kind of kind of I thought that was really interesting. There's a curious moment when they're looking through the periscope where
Which is kind
Bond
of
kind of
surreal as well. Just the
what is
fact, the
going on with
idea.
that? Up periscope killer, yeah. And yeah, that's out of a completely different
It's
novel,
such
isn't
a weird exaggeration because you have this huge hydraulic system, and presumably the thing that's going up is like about the size of a finger. Couldn't you just have a
it?
tiny thing?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know. Yeah, and they don't even hear it coming up. Got this
No,
huge.
the hydraulics.
What's that? There's this noise every time we have a
I
meeting.
tell you what, that mouse, he's got the worst arthritis.
You tell him to turn it down a bit.
Uh,
Yeah. But he sees actually kind of I think the back of some apparatchik's head, and he kind of says, "Oh yeah, kind of he looks like he's from one of the southern republics." So it's this
yeah.
really interesting stratification of actually who's in the room.
Mm.
That's such a weird scene that because it's like they're watching silent cinema, isn't it? It's another cinematic moment, really. But it's really kind of peep show booth.
As
Um,
well, yeah, and it's also reflecting the idea of the people who are going to film James Bond, presumably without the audio, while he's having sex with Tatiana in the
mm,
hotel room. It's people
yeah,
watching people, and as readers, we're kind of all over the place. Where I mean, Bond might be our hero, but when we know things that he doesn't know, we've spent a long
yeah,
time on the wrong side of the. And I think that he does something really cunning, Fleming, in the. I think if you with it's like something Hitchcock would exploit a lot. If you're with people who spend a lot of time planning something, you can't help but want the plan to succeed. It kind of distresses you that the
mm,
plan is falling apart. Aside from the moral things, just because of the momentum that you're with these people heading in this direction and you've seen the energy expended, you've sunk cost into that thing. And then, oh, it's not going to work. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess I'm glad because Bond isn't dead, but.
yeah. Well, following on from that, I did notice a few times actually, kind of towards the end when they're on the train, the switching of point of view is actually quite regular. So kind of even in the space of a couple of paragraphs, you switch from Bond's point of view to Tatiana's, and that can be really quite clunky if it's not done well, and and so I kind of felt as though kind of you're in quite safe hands actually. That kind of his control of that, and as you say, we don't see everything from Bond's point of view. We know a lot more than him for a lot of the narrative. And so even then, when Tatiana comes into it, we start to see things again from her point of view. It's not just narrated from Bond's perspective there, but it never feels as though he's kind of lost control of the narrative.
Yeah, and also it exposes Bond as a character because it would discussing it, we can analyze it and we can say, God, but it's never my subjective feeling of, Bond, you're such an idiot. Look behind you. I mean, well, it is sometimes, but you're not, you know more than he does, but you can kind of see why he's going in that direction,
Yeah,
towards
yeah,
the trap
yeah. No,
door.
absolutely. Yeah, and he kind of knows it's a trap, doesn't he, as well?
Mm.
But yeah, but that's right. It doesn't feel as though he's the stupidest man in the room.
No, he's approaching it like a gambler. He's sort of
Yes,
like,
yeah, yeah.
I'm putting it on black. I know the ball could land on red and I'll lose everything, but I'm going to put it on black anyway.
Yeah, that's right. He says towards the end, doesn't he, about he just wants to see the game play out.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, he's a player till the end, very definitely.
Right, right. Final one, final point.
I'm not sure I've got another one now. Have you got one?
Oh, let's have a think. Let's have a quick think. Oh, yeah, I have actually. It came with you talking about cinema earlier, and you talked about uh, all these different references and meta references, and of course, it finishes with a cliffhanger. And again, also a point you made earlier. So this is definitely your number seven, not mine. You talked about this is the Bond book where you kind of have to have read the others to fully appreciate it. Of course, you could pick it up and read it, and many people read these out of order now. But you can
Yeah,
imagine in 1957 buying this as a new Bond book, being thoroughly, satisfied, but getting to the end and going, "Oh my God, are they really going to kill him? Is that
And
Fleming going, I'm a bit tired of this character now. I'm going to get rid of him." Is it a Reichenbach Falls moment,
yeah,
or is it a sort of Saturday morning serial moment like Flash Gordon or The Rocket Man, where you
yeah.
often would have a cliffhanger?
Yeah, it's funny because Holmes is mentioned, isn't he, earlier on in the novel when the Russians are talking about the kind of what constitutes a kind of English sensibility, and it's another one of those intertextual references. I
Mm.
remember I watched
And
obviously.
Bulldog Drummond is mentioned
Yes,
by
that's
by
also
Grant.
true.
Says, "Don't do any of that Bulldog Drummond
Common stuff.
errors." Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bit déclassé, isn't it? Kind of. He
Mm.
should. Yeah, he's not up on his reading, is he, Red Grant? Really?
No.
Um, no, he's not. He's not reading Ambler. He's reading Bulldog Drummond. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to. Oh, it's gone. I think I was going to kind of say something else there about something, but there we go.
But about the cliffhanger at the end.
Oh yeah, that's right. So I saw the film first, obviously before I read the novel, and I was when I read the novel, I was really shocked. That kind of, so I thought, hang on,
He's
oh, yeah,
dead. It's the
dead.
last novel in the series.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when does this come in the sequence? So kind of, yeah. So I mean, it must have been quite a surprise, for those reading in
Mm.
the kind of those who are following Bond, to get to that point, and all of a sudden he swoons, and that's it. You don't get kind of how Bond wakes up, an epilogue, 3 weeks later, and he's told everything. Yeah, it's quite daring, isn't it?
Mm.
For to to allow the reader to have that moment of suspension, because
Yeah.
presumably all of his editors and everything else would have said, "Oh no, make sure that it's nicely, we have a nice resolution here." I suppose he had the kind of the power then to be able to say, "No, this is where the book ends."
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. I mean, I know that they changed it for Live and Let Die, where his American editor said, "You can't kill Felix. We need an American character if we're going to keep selling this to an American
Oh, is that right?
audience." So Felix Leiter survived purely through the intervention of the American editor. But here, yeah, you do get a feeling that he's flexing his muscles a little and saying, "You know what? I don't have to do that anymore. I can do what I want."
I can do what I want. Yeah,
And
yeah.
he's going to go even. He's going to be kind of, and I don't think he gets enough respect for this. He's going to be kind of radical as we go on in the series. The Spy Who Loved Me being the most radical of his experiments.
What's the one where it begins where Bond has come back from Russia and tries to kind of he's going to be assassinating him? That might be the man with the golden
I think
gun.
it is. Yeah, I think it's a very late one.
Because I remember that when I read that as a kid and thinking, what? Kind
Yeah,
of, because that's
yeah.
not completely different to the film. I think I haven't read it since, but kind of that was a real moment of, this isn't Bond. This
Well,
isn't Bond.
You Only Live Twice kind of ends with with like a M writing the obituary and
Yes.
Bond being an amnesiac on a Japanese, believing himself to be Japanese, and looking like Sean Connery.
Oh, don't. Yeah.
Just give you that mental image.
With his, yes, prosthetic makeup and prosthetic hair. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I have a real appreciation for how different the books and the films are.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Up until this stage, I mean, I think as we go on, there will be cross-fertilization as Fleming watches the movies and starts
Yeah,
thinking,
sure.
"Oh, okay, I better make him Scottish, I guess."
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
When does Fleming die?
Fleming dies, sorry, in the mid 60s. I think it's like
Yeah.
65, 66, somewhere
Right. So
around
he only
there.
sees a couple of the films, two or three of the films then.
Yeah, I think he's seen the first two, and maybe he's on the set of Goldfinger.
Okay.
I'm not sure if he saw Goldfinger, but yeah, there's a lot of photographs of him sort of mucking about with Sean Connery, and both great enthusiasts of golf. So
Of
they had
course.
something to talk about.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? When you kind of look at production stills from Ipcress File, which is 65, and of course made by the same team who made the Bond movies, and you
Mm.
see pictures of Dayton with Michael Caine playing Harry Palmer, and Kane basically looks like a kind of a blonde version of Dayton. Same glasses, wearing the same kind of kind of shirt, kind of, and I think Dayton's showing kind of Michael Caine how to make a scrambled eggs, I think it is, or an omelette. And so it's interesting how that kind of the almost the insertion of the kind of the persona of the writer into the very fabric and look of the film. It hasn't, I suppose Fleming doesn't really survive long enough into the Bond sequence for that to kind of happen much more organically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Fleming was very much outside of the that process, and they very quickly made it into their own things while
Yeah.
retaining, as you say, Fleming. One thing that again, I don't think it gets enough credit is how wonderful the titles are. I mean, they're a bit like Beatles songs. They're so perfect. You think nobody created them. They
Mm,
arrived on the earth and
yes.
just ready made. But from Russia with Love, Diamonds Are Forever, Moonraker, these are just the ones we've done so far in the series. Live and Let Die and Casino Royale, all of those feel so resonant,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
perfect.
Yeah. No. Yeah. That's absolutely right, isn't it? There's something of this kind of phrase maker,
Mm,
which again you don't really think of him as. But
mm,
like the titles of the chapters, you don't even think of him as that kind of writer. But you're right. Yeah. They sing, don't they?
absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks, Bri, for joining me for this conversation. It was like old times.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, it's been a great pleasure, John. Thanks very much for inviting me.